Hello, my name is Anastasia Pouliou. I work at CEDEFOP as an expert in qualifications and credentials, and I was asked today to present to you some important insights and findings from our research on micro-credentials for vet and labor market learning. This is an important three-year study that actually started back in 2020 that had mainly three objectives. The first objective was to understand better how micro-credentials are perceived in Europe. The second and very important aim we had was to see the links between micro-credentials and evolving qualification systems. And the third and important objective was to see what is the added value, what are the benefits for the different end users in Europe with regards to how micro-credentials are used. CEDEFOP's work has been supervised by the advisory group that is composed from representatives of member states, from the management board of CEDEFOP, from European Commission and trade unions, and they were overlooking our study and were giving us important feedback throughout the whole, let's say, time we were embarking on that trip. Of course, we were very actively engaged, not only discussions taking place in Europe, but also across the border, because this is a very important phenomenon that has attracted a lot of political attention. And of course, the way, let's say, the topic of micro-credentials is conceptualized, what are the arguments, let's say, for or against it was very important for us. And we saw that the arguments for micro and alternative credentials were mainly focusing on the benefits of a demand-driven and flexible system, let's say, giving employers and learners a high degree of choice. But there has been also a very important tension between flexibility and stability, which has been key to understanding how these modern qualifications and credentials are actually trying to evolve. As I said, we're very eager to have an important mapping exercise and to see how different countries in Europe are trying to define the important characteristics. And we saw that there has been a lot of uncertainty that is linked to the naming and function of credit, and different types of short learning activities have emerged. Dozens of different terms have been used also at national level, for example, digital badges, nano degrees, micro qualifications, module certificates, and even partial qualifications. So, in a way, that was an evidence of a kind of a more practical, flexible, on demand, and short learning experience, as we saw. But there's a kind of a tension between how the definition of micro credentials could evolve, whether it can be a tight versus a loose definition, especially when we are considering how countries have evolved after the post pandemic period. All the time we're reflecting whether this is something new or whether this is an old wine with a new label. And of course, we saw that not only it's not new, but it's rather a phenomenon that is very rapidly growing. And it is, in a way, an opportunity to define better what you already know and to standardize the already existing offer, especially when we think about labor market. And we also had a very specific focus and interest on sectors, and we had an extensive, let's say, stakeholder survey and important, let's say, exercise, and wanted to understand in which kind of sectors this topic is rather flourishing. And we saw that in areas like ICT, engineering, manufacturing, and construction, but also in hospitality, human health, and social work, these would be the areas that micro credentials would flourish, and this was very important for our research. Now, about the main characteristics of micro-credentials, of course, the credentials we identified would indicate mainly the title, the date of issuing, the identity of the holder, who is the provider, of course, and what are the achieved learning outcomes. We're very much interested to see what is the mode of delivery, whether it's an online learning versus face-to-face mode of delivery, and who are those types of learners, the end users. And our research shows that these credentials are mainly targeting adults, employees, new hires, even individual people in their effort to upskill and reskill, right? And as a kind of these type of credentials would be a supplement to what they already have, their formal qualifications, let's say. So they were a very important addition. And why is that so? Because they appeared as a way, let's say, to address what the formal qualifications couldn't, mainly to timely respond to labor market needs. Of course, there are important links between micro-credentials and qualification systems. And the reason why we saw that is because there's a lot of, let's say, proliferation and variety of credentials that are falling outside the formal qualifications, that are operating solely in the labor market. At the same time, even if we have this, let's say, important picture, we realize that these types of credentials are not there to diminish what is already existing or the labor market value of recognized formal qualifications, but rather they are, as I say, they appear as an effort to push the system, a qualification system, to become more flexible and more responsive to what labor market needs. But of course, there's always these alarming voices that are warning us against this, in a way, fragmentation of knowledge that we saw happening, or even, for example, discouraging people from exiting too early from education and training. And of course, these alarming voices are very much heard, they are very much respected, but our data and our research shows that this phenomenon is very much linked to what is already happening, at least in the formal system. There are important links to modularization, to partial qualifications. And you can see the slide I'm sharing, different examples from countries in Europe. Modularization, for example, is very common in adult learning, and this is the case, for example, in Belgium, Czechia, Denmark, or Hungary. At the same time, the creations would use different terms, micro qualifications, but still, these types of credentials would mainly refer to shorter types of learning, units of learning outcome that would lead to shorter training programs at even EQF levels 2 to 4. In Ireland, there's a very long-standing practice with modules and the types of qualifications, freestanding qualifications that would share those characteristics of credentials, but they are not branded as such. At the same time, there are important links between micro-credentials and recognition of prior learning, and we can see a double, let's say, landscape being formed here. Either micro-credentials can be an outcome of an RPL process, or they can be a tool enabling, let's say, recognized pathways. For instance, in the cases that someone would like to gain access to an education or program, or to give even an exemption from a part of a program. So in that case, micro-credentials have a very important role to play. Of course, there are different barriers and challenges we need to consider because micro-credentials have become a global trend indeed, but have they proved their potential? From what we see, if quality assurance is missing or is lacking, this is an important barrier. At the same time, we heard before that there is a lot of uncertainty with regards to the important nature, the profile of micro-credentials, and also the way learning outcomes are assessed, the way they are documented, and even when, for example, in the case of different countries, national authorities would be reluctant in recognizing formally what is actually taking place outside the formal system. So this is an important, let's say, these are important barriers we need to consider. Of course, evidence of their value and impact is still scarce, especially if we think about robust national qualification systems that are not that compatible, they are not easing their integration into their system, and also in cases that these types of credentials that are existing would not have, let's say, would not be given the opportunity to get stuck, to get accumulated towards something bigger, or even towards a full qualification. So evidence of their value and impact at the moment remains scarce, but still our research tried, let's say, to shed light in the tunnel. For example, we saw cases in different countries that are opening up the framework to micro-credentials, and we see, for instance, different, again, types of qualifications being used, like in Malta, for instance, they are discussing awards, or even in Poland, the market qualifications, the characteristics resemble a lot micro-credentials, or even supplementary qualifications that could be comparable to micro-credentials, as is the case in Slovenia. So there's a very diverse qualifications landscape being formed at the moment. However, what we did within the course of our research is we tried to conduct an extensive survey program that was launched targeting 4 different stakeholder groups: employers, employees, students and other learners, and also individuals who are not currently employed. This survey was running from December 2022 to January 2023, and we saw that in the question that whether these type of end users were already using micro-credentials for training purposes, we'd see a big percentage currently trying to find out what would be the added value for them. At the same time, in another stakeholder group survey we conducted, and when we asked employees, students, and other learners, and also individuals who are not currently employed, where these type of credentials have helped them get promoted, we saw again a 46% of those saying no, that they not really get help. However, there was an important remaining part of 30% who said yes, and the very last 24% who didn't know or could not answer. So you can see again the picture at the moment remains a bit diverse, but still the way different end users would perceive micro-credentials is very subjective. It's really depending on who you are. For example, if you're a learner, employee, employer, or event provider, there are different benefits, different advantages in terms of career progression or advancement. Because micro-credentials are in essence a part of a broader system of credentials and qualifications which involve these more multiple stakeholders and learning context. So an in-depth analysis of this added value is crucial in understanding better how and whether these credentials can indeed achieve their initial aspiration to become a currency for lifelong learning. Of course, when we think about trust, it's a very important aspect, and trust in micro-credentials is mainly shaped by formal quality assurance mechanism, as you can see in the slides, and there are different other components, because, for example, for the mapping of the retail and manufacturing certifications we have made, we saw also that assessment is central, for instance, to the trust, and it is a feature that users strongly associate with the added value of micro-credentials. Of course, important information and guidance about microcredentials is necessary. We need to know who is this provider, what kind of reputation or credibility is out there. And also, it's important to enhance metadata availability and compliance with functionality and quality criteria that would make those credentials comparable, whether they are situated within or outside qualification frameworks. Of course, when we are discussing the vision for the future, we see there are different scenarios that are trying to be involving, from a European level database of trustworthy and quality assurance micro-credentials to more incremental approaches that are based on metadata. These are important because micro-credentials, in essence, could thus be conceptualized as components in dynamic skills ecosystems, which can be local, they can be sectoral, transsectoral, or even transnational, and they can be linked to even value chain connectivity in countries in Europe. But we should not forget the user and the system perspective. These two are quite different, and each of the scenarios that would be evolving in the future would have advantages, but also challenges given the diversity of provision. What is important to note at the moment is that given the multiple purposes of microcredentials at the moment, and the different business trade, for instance, sometimes it becomes difficult to decide what kind of credentials would be eligible for the inclusion, let's say, in a micro-credential database that would be developing, or who would be the legitimate gatekeeper, or what would it take to ensure that this kind of database of credentials would be up to date. And for this reason, CEDEFOL will not stop the research. We will continue with a new strand of work for the next, let's say, 3 years to come. We're currently at the moment of developing a new call for tender and really trying to understand what is needed for these type of important phenomena of credentials to go ahead in the future. And those of you who would like to get more insights and information on the publications we have produced, of course, there's a dedicated project page at CEDEFOP. We have already published a lot of reports and a briefing note. We have released already a podcast on the topic, and a new one is lying ahead for the year 2023-2024. Please stay tuned. I try to access the project page of CEDEFOP, and I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I wish I was there with you in your important country and to discuss this important aspect in person. Thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.